Okay, so this video is going to be a bit tricky because I don't know what to call it. As I am recording this video, I have no idea what title I gave this video. I'm very curious to see what it becomes. But hey, what's up everybody, Commander Radix here, bringing you another episode of History and Lore, my series where I talk about the history and lore of this world. And today we're starting off a sort of sub-series, a series within a series. One thing I'm really interested in is metaphysics. Whoa, Radix, that's a strange word, metaphysics. What does that mean? Good question. That's what I'm here to talk about. I think you guys who have watched this channel long enough have realized that I am a bit of an enchanted person. You know, there's this whole re-enchantment movement out there to sort of push back. Well, in short, the modern world doesn't acknowledge, but is nevertheless haunted by spirits, angels, demons, and saints. In our time, many yearn to break free of the prison of flat, secular materialism, to see and know reality as it truly is. I totally just stole the intro to the Lord of Spirits podcast with that. But it's a good sort of thesis statement or mission statement of this sub-series, which I wasn't sure entirely what to call it. But it's a series where I'm going through things like metaphysics, the classical and medieval worldview, things like the history of mystic theology and logos theology. Basically a crash course through the sort of concepts that are all around re-enchantment of the world. And reintroducing these ideas, these old ideas, these traditional ideas to a modern audience, which would be you, the viewer. In some ways, we're reintroducing concepts that already existed in the traditions of your culture. In other ways, we're sort of clarifying and, you know, really looking at the nuance and picking apart some old ideas that the modern world thinks they understand, but really they don't. That's sort of the idea of this sub-series. And I wasn't really sure what to call this sub-series. Profoundly Retarded Peacemaker on Twitter suggested Commander's Classics. After all, this is sort of dealing with classical philosophy, the classical worldview. And I think it works. Commander's Classics. Maybe I'll even make a word art for the title of the series. Boom! Is it there? Did I actually make it, or did I just not do it? But this is the first episode of Commander's Classics within the History and Lore series. And it's within History and Lore because it deals with history and it especially deals with lore. Now, when you're tackling an issue like this, re-enchantment with creation, with the world, right? Where do you even start? Do you start with a look at what the medieval synthesis was? Do you start by looking at some of the apologetic arguments made by pre-Christian classical civilization for classical theism? Do you start with the gospel and sort of looking at it through the lens of logos theology? Do you start with the works of Plato and his dialogues from Socrates? Or Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching? Well, Commander's Classics is not necessarily going to follow a logical order. We're going to be sort of scatterbrained in this series, just because I want to cover the topics I feel like talking about at this moment. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are starting off with the philosophy of René Guénon. René Guénon. René Guénon. René Guénon. And to understand René Guénon's philosophy, we have to start with his first published philosophical work, which is An Introduction to the Study of the Hindu Doctrines. Wow, that's a mouthful of a title. And so I was thinking about how do we cover parts of René Guénon's philosophy, which I think can be really helpful, although I'll put some disclaimers as we go on. Well, there are multiple parts to that book. Why don't I just sort of make videos summarizing each part? So at the core of this video, I am just sort of outlining part 1 of Introduction to the Hindu Doctrines by René Guénon. That is chapters 1 through 6. And it doesn't help that this first part is called Preliminary Questions, which doesn't make a good catchy YouTube title. And for that matter, Introduction to the Study of the Hindu Doctrines is not a strong YouTube title video either. So I really don't know what to title this video. I am so lost. Now I guess we should start off with the question of who is René Guénon? René Guénon was born in 1886 in France. He himself was of French-Egyptian heritage. He was half French, half Egyptian. And he is, at his core, a philosopher that developed the philosophy or school of thought called perennialism or traditionalism. These two terms are both used to describe him. Now, I don't think he necessarily identified with both, maybe perennialist. Really, René Guénon became very popular with his writings, and he developed this following, and that following eventually resulted in the birth of perennialism and traditionalism. And I myself was a sort of pseudo-perennialist for a long time in my life. But the core idea of perennialism, which it isn't even necessarily the core idea of Guénon's work exactly, but the core idea around perennialism is that all of the world's religions, it's mostly focused on religion, all of the world's religions are sort of attempts to describe one singular truth, one truth that is expressed in the form of several religions. Now, perennialism can sometimes be described as that New Age idea of
all religions are basically equal.
That phrase just makes my blood curdle, because all religions are not equal. In fact, they are different in very fundamental ways. And that's not necessarily what René Guénon was arguing, as I think we'll find out more as we go through this episode and future episodes on René Guénon's philosophy. But perennialism, the perennial school, can be sort of oversimplified as that. The idea that all religions are equal, that they're all pointing to some sort of metaphysical, supernatural reality. Now, René Guénon himself was born and raised Roman Catholic, but as he developed his philosophy and was releasing books, he was sort of surprised to find that the Catholic Church wasn't that happy with his writings, because it's basically relativizing all religion. So eventually he's going to leave Roman Catholicism, which is kind of ironic because there are some parts of Vatican II that sort of inch closer towards René Guénon's philosophy, but that's a whole nother topic. Eventually, Guénon is going, after spending a long time flirting with Hinduism and looking at Hinduism, he's ultimately going to convert to Islam, and specifically Sufi Islam, the more esoteric and more mystical type of Islam. But yeah, to sum up, the core ideas of Guénon himself is that there is a sort of primordial tradition, this true metaphysic, through which all other religions, and when we get into Guénon's work, not just religion, but culture, civilization, are expressions of that metaphysic. But the problem is the metaphysic cannot be understood intellectually. In order to understand it intellectually, you have to put it into words, and by the mere act of putting the immutable, by putting the ineffable into words, it becomes something that is not the ineffable. True metaphysic is inherently undescribable. It cannot be put into words. Think about in Plato's dialogue of Cratylus, where he sort of brings up the idea that language is sort of taking something specific and applying something general to it. You lose some of the information when you describe a thing with a word. It reminds me of Yukio Mishima's argument in Sun and Steel, the idea that words are kind of a corrosive element. That the moment you put something into words, things are lost, and the truth is lost, and words sort of break things down like some sort of acid. Guénon takes that perspective of the moment we put things into words, it becomes an expression. It's somehow connected to the true metaphysic, which isn't something that can be intellectually conceived of, and by intellectually conceiving of it, it becomes sort of an expression, a branch, but not truly that metaphysic. That's the core of his idea. Which brings him to the idea that all religions are some sort of adaptation, is the phrase he would use, adaptation of the true metaphysic. That is no longer the true metaphysic because it's been put into words, and the true metaphysic cannot be put into words. Now, I really like a lot of René Guénon's work. I really like his approach to metaphysics, which appears to be really, frankly, medieval in his understanding. I appreciate that he is able to understand diverse traditions and cultures and civilizations throughout time, and he's really able to understand the East, and we'll talk about what that means later. He's able to understand the East in a way, in fact, he's probably the only Westerner able to understand the East at that time, in a time, this is like the late 1800s, early 1900s, a time when the East isn't really producing much scholarship, and the West Orientalists who are trying to study the East really are doing a bad job because their brains are infected with like Enlightenment ideas and a lot of rationalism that makes them unable to really understand Eastern traditions, which did not go through the Enlightenment, did not go through the Protestant Reformation, did not go through a Renaissance period that hyper-valued reason. Which brings us to this book called Introduction to the Study of the Hindu Doctrines. It is the first of Guénon's work, and it is a bit rough around the edges. His writing style in this book is a lot of reading this book made me laugh in a few places, not because it was intentionally funny, because René Guénon just sounds so bitter, and he really, frankly, arrogant, and is really looking at other scholars, especially Western Orientalists, as being just completely retarded. He comes across very bitter in this book, and from what I understand in other works, he's less bitter as time goes on, but it is a rough around the edges book, but at the same time it is foundational to understanding any of his philosophy. But he's writing this book because he's very dissatisfied. It's coming out in 1921, and he's looking at a lot of the Orientalist books written by Westerners about the East. And by the East, we're talking about not just like what you typically think of the East, China, Japan, but also India, Persia, the Middle East, things like that, Egypt. He's really dissatisfied with Western scholarship towards the East because it's using inherently Western thinking, which at that time was heavily influenced by things like I just said, the Enlightenment, hyper-rationalism. Guénon looks at Western culture, Western civilization, the Western tradition and mindset in particular as gradually degenerating, in particular through trends after the Renaissance. Now, he comes off as very anti-Western in this book. From what I understand, as time goes on, he's eventually going to soften up towards his position towards the West, but he is very much doing apologetics for the East in this book, which makes sense given the context. It was published in 1921, but a lot of the problems Guénon identifies in this book really resonate with us today in the 21st century. The title of the book is Introduction to the Study of the Hindu Doctrines. It is not an introduction to the Hindu doctrines. It is not an introduction to Hinduism. This book really, the second part of it, the second half of it gets a little bit more into Hinduism, but it really isn't a book about Hinduism. What it is it is a correction of the Western mindset, the hyper-rational Western mindset. It's correcting the Western mindset from the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, that he thinks that these epistemological reforms in Western culture makes Westerners unable to really understand Eastern culture. In his own words, he says that the first goal is to, quote, outline as clearly as possible the essential and fundamental differences existed between the general modes of Eastern and Western thought. He sort of bemoans more of the Western scholarship towards the East, this Orientalism. He says that a lot of scholars have wasted their entire lives dedicating themselves to the study of a subject they are not outfitted to understand yet. That a lot of Western scholars, through their misunderstandings, have instead created misinterpretations and misinformation about the East that they are perpetuating through Western languages to the West, hoping to widen the misunderstanding between the two cultures. And he compares their work to like when you're doing a translation job. You do not want to translate word for word. You want to be able to translate the grammar of the language you're translating. And he's looking at the Western Orientalist and he compares them to translating word for word. The good news, he says, is that once you understand the Eastern mindset, the Easterners will just tell you what they believe. They don't have any sort of esoteric teaching. Not to the same degree you see in things in the West that were popular, especially in the 1920s, things like Freemasonry, for example. Freemasonry, which, by the way, René Guénon will involve himself with. And the key thesis, the key idea Guénon has is that the West-East dichotomy is not saying like, here's the West and here's the East, two civilizations that have always been opposed to each other in mindset. What he says is, the East is kind of technically how things were. He's going to connect the East to the primordial tradition. He's going to say that the West itself was more like the East, and that they ran parallel to each other until the West started to diverge from the East. He says that if you were to draw like a chart, a timeline to show the East and West diverging from each other, you would get two straight lines and then the West would sort of start to fall off, but the East is still going straight. The East hasn't changed much, is what he argues. Now, this makes sense from a 1921 perspective, but with hindsight and the benefit of hindsight, we know places like in the East, Japan, Korea, for example, that they're starting to also diverge in the same pattern as the West. So it's this weird thing where like it's two straight lines, the West branches off, the East keeps going straight, and then eventually it starts to turn towards the West as far as it's concerned. Guénon was really confident that the East was basically going to stay the same forever because it had stayed pretty much the same forever since ancient times, while the East was diverging greatly. But I guess he didn't predict World War II and its consequences. Now, with all that said, I want to get some disclaimers out of the way. I am not vouching for René Guénon. I am not saying that everything he says is true, nor am I saying that I agree with everything he says. He is not infallible, and Guénon himself recognized himself as such. He recognized that he wasn't always right, despite, he sounds very full of himself in this book, but he will go on and revise positions he's held in the past. Famously, his view of Buddhism changed, did a complete 180 during his lifespan. As an Orthodox Christian, I look up to figures like Saint Seraphim Rose and Hieromonk Damascene. He's the guy who wrote Christ the Eternal Tao. Saint Seraphim Rose, when he was going through his spiritual journey, really enjoyed René Guénon. He sort of talks about René Guénon being one of his main spiritual influences that helped him the most after Orthodox Christianity, which of course he really clung on to as the absolute truth. There is a letter written by Saint Seraphim Rose about his study of René Guénon that I recommend any Orthodox Christian watching this video read, because he does point out a lot of things that I agree with that are incorrect about René Guénon. René Guénon should be read in the context of a proper traditional understanding. Both Hieromonk Damascene and Seraphim Rose worked indirectly with René Guénon, but in the end they both really investigated Orthodox Christianity, which René Guénon didn't really do, and both of them ended up walking away believing that they had found the absolute truth in the Orthodox Church. Who knows what would have happened if René Guénon himself had spent more time looking into the Orthodox Church. It's also important to keep in mind that René Guénon himself was also affiliated with Freemasonry and the occult. However, it's kind of a question of how much he really believed those things. He certainly went against a lot of occultic ideas. He calls out a lot of New Age cults. He calls out Blasphemy. He calls out, I think he calls out the guy that summoned the demon. Aleister Crowley, he calls out him. He calls them anti-traditions, right? He's not a fan of them. And I think he sort of really isn't impressed with the Freemasons over time. Even though he did a lot of work for the Freemasons, I do question how much he really saw Freemasonry to be what Freemasonry claims Freemasonry is. And in the end, he seems to have died a very devout Sufi Muslim. It's said that he never missed his prayers, things like that. When he eventually retires from public life in Egypt and sort of locks his door and very rarely entertains guests. I also want to add that this will be an incomplete analysis of his work. The focus of today's video is just the first part of the introduction to the Hindu Doctrines. I understand that people looking into René Guénon can very easily slip into the, all religions are the same stuff, but I also disavow that. And I don't necessarily think that's what René Guénon believed either. But without further ado, let's get into part 1, Preliminary Questions. where René Guénon is going to tackle a lot of the epistemological errors the West makes when studying Eastern doctrines. So first, we've done a lot of different talking about the idea of West versus East, right, from René Guénon's perspective. But now we really need to define that for us to be able to talk about it. What is the West and what is the East? That is the main idea behind the first chapter in his book, which is literally called East and West. By the way, he has a book called East and West, which I haven't read yet, but it sounds like, from what I've heard, it's like a less angry version of Introduction to the Hindu Doctrines. The West is a bit easier to define than the East, as we will see later. The West, René Guénon equates to Europe. Europe, the European peoples, and everything sort of bound up with them. So that would include, for example, Americans, Canadians, Australians, Europeans outside of Europe, effectively. The West isn't intrinsically tied to geography, it just happens to work out that way. But when a mass migration of Europeans arrive to a new location far away from Europe, if it's still a bunch of Europeans just interacting with each other in one location and growing, they still have a European mindset. In fact, Guénon kind of points to the idea that such a huge European population separated from Europe can even have stronger versions of the characteristics already found in Europe. That the Europeans outside of Europe are going to be like a more intense version of the Europeans in Europe because of the sort of selection founder effect. I know I've definitely heard ideas that I've once heard someone say that all the crazy Europeans in the Middle Ages, well, in the early modern period, left Europe and went over to like the colonies because you had to be crazy to go over there, which left very unique populations in places like America and Australia compared to your average English person, for example. He also makes it clear that while he will use terminology of things like race, for example, he doesn't connect the idea of being Western, being of the West, being the West, with something as material as DNA. He doesn't really look at Westernity as being a genetically held idea. He sort of rejects that. He talks about how there is no, like, seed population from which all Europeans, all members of the West descend from. He recognizes that Europeans are made from a bunch of different groups. If we were to get really genetic with it, we could talk about the different East hunter-gatherers, West hunter-gatherers. We could talk about the early European farmers coming in from Anatolia, right? So genetically, there is differences within the European population. But he says that it's not a genetic thing, but at the same time, you're able to intuitively tell when something or someone is Western. The mindset of being a Westerner, a Western mindset, transcends genetics and race. It transcends that. It transcends materiality. But that's not to say that it's not real. And he says that you can prove this just by intuitively knowing these things, by experiencing these things. You can recognize certain cultural, not even necessarily cultural, but mindset commonalities between as distant Western pieces as Americans to Russians. There are some commonalities they hold that an Indian or a Chinese person might not have. This is, to René Guénon, the West. And the West has three sort of strands, three strains that are fundamental to it. He characterizes the West as coming from the Greeks, the Romans, and the Jews. First, we have the Greeks, and Greek influence is most supreme in the Western mindset in forms of things like philosophy and science. Philosophy and science in the Western mind ultimately comes from the Greeks. Romans, on the other hand, the Roman Empire, right? The Romans and their cultural influence on Western civilization is more social than philosophical, more social than intellectual. And we'll talk about what Guénon means by intellectual in another video. That's a whole thing. But Western concepts of state, of law, of institutions, Guénon says ultimately comes from the Romans. That can be traced back to the Romans. He also adds that the Romans borrowed everything that is intellectual in the intellectual sphere, things like philosophy. The Romans ultimately borrowed their foundations from the Greeks. So Greek influence can be sort of felt in anything the West developed from the Romans, for example. Then we have the Jews. The Jewish contribution to the Western mindset ultimately is in the form of religion, of religious thinking of the Westerners. And Guénon recognizes that the Jews themselves are outside of the West. They're not, or rather outside of Europe. And he's saying this ties into the idea that this is not necessarily a genetic thing. He's saying that, you know, this out of Europe idea, tradition, is fundamental to Western civilization, to the Western ideas and Western mentality. And of course, this is going, not necessarily Judaism, the religion, but Christianity is coming from that Jewish root. The East, on the other hand, is much more trickier to define than the West. For example, the West is European culture. There is one Western civilization. The East is more difficult because there are multiple civilizations within the East, as Guénon sees it. And not only that, ethnically, racially, the East is much more diverse. Guénon talks about the East including things like China, it includes India, it includes Persia and the Middle East. However, he does say that there are some common principles we can apply to sort of understand what is Eastern as opposed to what is Western. Although he is ultimately going to argue that Western is more of an aberration, a shift from the base, which is what we could call Eastern. Likewise, he also connects that this isn't exactly geographic. He says that the Levantine people of the Levant are, in their mindset, Western. They are part of Western civilization, even though geographically they would fall more into what Guénon would consider the East. Like Islamic civilization, he would consider Eastern. Now, like I touched up in the introduction to this video, the East-West dichotomy is not a symmetrical dichotomy. It's not like you take a piece of paper, rip it in half, and say, this is East, this is West. These aren't equal to each other in scope. Guénon argues that one way you can see the East-West dichotomy is just by looking at a map, looking at Europe itself, and looking at Asia. And looking how Asia is this huge landmass and Europe is this relatively small portion kind of sticking out of Asia. He says that that is more illustrative of what this West-East dichotomy is. The reason why the dichotomy exists, according to Guénon, is because the West, a certain group of humanity based around Europe, based around Greece, Roman, and Jewish ideas, started to diverge from the rest of humanity in their mindset, in their way of thinking. Ultimately, Guénon argues that the West is just the East, and the East is the standard for humanity. The West is a part of the East that has gone AWOL, that has gone rogue, that has separated from the rest of the pack. The East-West dichotomy is not a dichotomy between two powers, according to Guénon. Rather, it is reflective of a divergence. Well, now, the question is, what changed, right? If the West is diverging from the East, what happened? What changed here? And when did that really start? Guénon points out that classical antiquity in the West was much more similar to the East at its time and in Guénon's time than the West was in Guénon's time. What I mean is to say is classical antiquity, pre-Socratic Greece, was more similar to China in pre-Socratic Greece's time and more similar to China in Guénon's time, right? As opposed to the distance between the modern-day West in 1921 compared to China in 1921. Differences between the East and West will continue to grow, but actually it's just because the West is diverging. The East stays stable. It stays the same from Guénon's point of view in 1921. Let's forget like 1945 and everything after that, right? It hasn't happened yet when Guénon is writing. I disagree with his position that the East will never change because we live in the 21st century East and it's very different. I say we, I do. I don't know about you. If I'm speaking English, you probably don't live in the East. But some of you definitely do. We got a lot of Filipinos watching this channel. Shout out to the Filipinos. But from Guénon's point of view, the East could be seen as the home of the spirit of stability, while the West was the home of the spirit of things like progress and evolution. From a Western perspective, the East could look like backwards, close-minded, set in their ways. From an Eastern standpoint, the West looks unstable, inconstant, always hankering for movement and always excited. The West is always on the chase for something, but it's never really contented. In this way, when we're talking about the East, what we're really talking about is tradition, true tradition, although there are caveats here, which I'll talk about in another video, hopefully. Unless this becomes one of those series where I just don't upload a second episode until 5 years later. Before the historical period, Guénon argues, the West borrowed intellectually a lot from the East. Now we should remember that the West in this prehistorical period is just Greece, right? The Romans haven't risen yet. The Jews haven't been inserted into Western civilization yet. It's just Greece, and Greece extensively borrows from the traditions of the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Persians, even the Indians, directly or indirectly. And they wouldn't hide it. The Greeks are very open, or were very open to the idea, to the fact that they were taking better ideas from civilizations they saw as older than them. It's in this chapter that Guénon mentions something called the classical prejudice, which will be the main subject for chapter 3. And the classical prejudice is the idea that all the ideas in ancient Greek civilization were native to Greece, created in Greece, with zero outside influence whatsoever. And in fact, when you see similar ideas show up in Indian civilization, that must have gotten there because of Greek influence, that the Greeks influenced them. Guénon argues that this is backwards. He does say that the Greeks are original. They're especially original in terms of art. Especially their way of sculpture making, which is interesting because of how realistic sculpture is, how tangible, how material, how sculpture has weight compared to other art forms, which really reflects a more Western mindset. But he says that especially when we look at Greek philosophical ideas, those ideas are inherently Eastern. And yet, even when the Greeks borrowed ideas from the East, they had to adapt it. Guénon likes to use this language of adapting or readapting, taking an idea and putting it into words for a specific purpose. So when the Greeks take Eastern ideas, they adapt it into the Greek language for the Greek mindset. The essential seed of Western thinking was already present inside the Greek people before the West had really become a civilization, Guénon argues. And the Greeks, the early Greeks in particular, really like to focus on the practical. They really like to focus on something they can use. They're very good with their hands, as we see with things like sculptures. They are very good with things they can touch and feel and hold. And when they take philosophical ideas from the East, which tend to be a bit more abstract, the Greeks tend to adapt it into a way that's a little bit more material. Although from us living in the 21st century, reading ancient Greek philosophy might feel very vague and abstract, but when you compare it to the Upanishads, when you compare it to the Vedas, it's much more concrete. And as a result, when Greeks take Eastern philosophy, they are putting restrictions, limitations on things because of their mindset. We'll see that a little bit more in chapter 3. Guénon also marks something that I think is really important, and that is that the divergence between East and West hasn't been consistently growing over time. Rather, there have been times when the West branches off, then starts to come back, then branches off, and starts to come back, gets really close, and then sort of rockets away. Guénon argues that Alexander the Great's conquest and Hellenism starts to bring the West a little bit more closer to the East, and interestingly enough, Guénon points to the Middle Ages as being the time period, the medieval period being the time period when the West starts coming back to the Eastern tradition, when it starts to more solidly become part of the Eastern tradition, almost you can say came back. There's this idea that the West, since before the historical period was running alongside the East, began to diverge a little bit in the classical period, a little bit comes back with Alexander, starts to leave, and then it's the Middle Ages that brings it back in line. That mostly being because the Middle Ages was a time period when the Europeans were able to accept more speculation, they were able to reject pure rationality a bit more, and they were more willing to rely on the spiritual. This is the Middle Ages. This is the height of Christendom. This is the time when Christianity has become the key ideology, the key religion, the key everything to Europe, to the West. And this is a time before any schism, before any arguments over how much authority the Pope had. You had one unified church. This golden age of Christendom, Guénon points out very interestingly, is the point when the West is starting to come back to, starting to return to tradition. It's when the Renaissance hits. That's when hyper-rationality really begins to be injected into European culture. The Renaissance hits. Okay, now we're really starting to dovetail away from the East. Renaissance, Protestant Reformation, Enlightenment. Guénon argues that the Enlightenment is basically just a rejection of all tradition, a rejection of the East. Keep in mind, East and tradition can kind of be used interchangeably in Guénon's context. We will talk about that more in another episode. And I would add, since Guénon's time, World War I, World War II, the postmodernism and social movements of the Cold War era, and then the technological digital revolution of the 21st century and at the end of the 20th century, these things probably made the gap even more wider, right? These made things worse. Although I do think now the East is starting to join the West in its turn towards rationalism, simply because the West, and I don't think Guénon gives the West enough credit in this book, the West, sure, it fails at a lot of the metaphysical stuff, but because of their hyper-rationality, the West is able to get a good, strong handle on the material, on technology, on medicine, on science. And because they have that material power, that technological advantage, that allows them to dominate the world, right? The British Empire, the sun never sets on, right? The United States drops atomic bombs, right? All the major technological innovations happen in the West with a few other, there are some discoveries in like China, right? China's important. But the West dominates the material. It dominates the, that sort of plane of existence. The East sort of is more focused towards metaphysics, focused towards what we could call spirituality. Although Guénon has a problem with calling the East spiritual, we'll talk about that in another episode. But we'll talk about that a bit more in the next chapter, this sort of, the effects of this divergence. Okay, chapter 3, the classical prejudice. Radix with an actual mic is back again. So in chapter 3, René Guénon gets more into detail with this classical prejudice idea, and he really begins his assault on Western epistemology, really. On modern Western epistemology, I should say. The classical prejudice is the idea that all of civilization comes from the Romans and Greeks, and that everything outside of that sphere can't really be called civilization. This prejudice is more emblematic of Guénon's time than it is ours, but there is a sort of similarity to what we see today. In Guénon's time, the West thought that everything outside of the West was barbarism. Everything outside the West was bad, and everything that was good about the world was created in Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem, and everything outside made in Cairo, made in Beijing, made in New Delhi, was all terrible, was all barbarism, right? And the reason being is that the East never progressed. You know, the West is progressive. The West has moved up. The West has become best. But the East is regressive. They're stuck in their ways, right? In our time, we're kind of in a different situation where there is still the idea that there is only one thing we can call civilization, but that civilization is all civilization on Earth, anywhere people live in a town, right? We live in one mono-civilization, and the idea that there could be multiple civilizations is a backwards, non-progressive way of looking at the world, because the moment we divide civilizations apart, then you can judge between the civilizations and determine which is superior, which is inferior. So we can't have different civilizations. What we have is different externals, but the internals are the same. And we're all one civilized society. which is funny because usually what they associate with civilized society are ultimately Western values. I am recording this in June during Pride Month. Sodomy isn't exactly thought of well in a lot of societies outside of the West, but the West looks at, you can determine a country's civilizational status, if it's civilized or barbarous, based on how they treat sodomites. So even though it's a different idea than what Guénon faced, it is kind of inherently the same idea. The idea that civilization equals progressivism, equals progress. That is the classical prejudice. It's just evolved over time. Guénon attacks the idea that there could possibly be only one civilization, and that being Western civilization, when Greek civilization itself admits to borrowing ideas from other civilizations, from Persia, Babylon, Egypt, Greece. Not Greece, India. Greece did not borrow from Greece, that wouldn't work. But he does use this chapter to talk a little bit more about things that were original to Greek thought, original creations of the Greeks, through the adoption of ideas from other civilizations. Particularly dialectics. Dialectics and syllogisms. This is one of those words that I've only read and never spoke out loud. Hold on. Syllogism. Greek dialectics and syllogism are a good way to take abstract ideas and put them into a digestible form for the Western mind. It can help take abstract ideas and turn them into more digestible, concrete ideas. However, at the same time, by doing that, it calcifies the ideas into standards, into ideas of correct and incorrect, something that isn't necessarily present in a lot of the Eastern thought. Guénon talks about how Plato will examine each question in the tiniest minute detail, only to result in a conclusion that largely doesn't really matter. And again, Guénon brings up that only the medieval age, only the Middle Ages sort of was able to break free from this hyper-rationality. They were able to escape the Greek inclinations towards rationalism because the Middle Ages was much more open to the idea of speculation, spirituality, things like that, than times before and after the Middle Ages. Now, because of this inclination, the West is not good at metaphysics, is what Guénon says. And likewise, the East is not really that good at materiality, historically, considering the imperialism of the 19th century and Western political dominance of the 20th and 21st centuries. Guénon sort of explains this by saying that the East has knowledge, the West has research, and the West can sometimes confuse the idea of research with knowledge, but Guénon posits that these are two separate ideas. True knowledge can only come from what is universal, and universal truth can only come from an understanding of metaphysics, a non-intellectual understanding of metaphysics. Metaphysics is what is beyond physics, what is beyond the material. Meanwhile, the West is going to really double down on the idea of empiricism. The West is going to look to the observable, tangible universe for knowledge. Now, this can be problematic because knowledge gained through empiricism or through material reality only can only be general knowledge or specified knowledge. So what do I mean by that? Let's consider naturalism. Naturalism, which is a very Western idea, even though we might be surprised to hear that. Western cultures historically had an inclination towards naturalism, this idea that nature should be observed closely, should be emulated, should be respected. This cult of nature was really popular, especially in things like pagandom. However, the East saw nature as a cycle of beginnings and endings, of coming and going. Consider in Japanese culture, we have the sakura tree, where the cherry blossom, right? During certain seasons of the year, it blooms, you have this beautiful sakura tree, beautiful sakura blossoms, and then they fall just as soon as they show up, and then the tree becomes barren again, right? It's this cycle. In Japan, we have the festival or the occurrence called hanami, where people will go and just watch the cherry blossoms fall from the trees. And the sakura is very important in Japanese culture because it symbolizes the cyclical nature of reality. Crops are planted, they grow, they are harvested, and then they're planted again, right? It's this never-ending cycle. Westerners are fascinated with that these plants are growing from the ground in this lifelike movement, we could say. They study the world, they study the things around them to find its deeper meaning. But when the East looked at nature, they considered it to mean that nature was illusionary. It was in the world of appearances. Now, here's the first time Guénon is going to specify and sort of give an apologetic for an Eastern idea that Westerners misunderstand. The idea of the world as illusionary does not mean that it does not have a reality to it. I've heard many times Westerners misunderstand the Buddhist idea, the Buddhist doctrine of the world as an illusion. That doesn't mean it's not real. What it means is that the material world around us is constantly in a transitory and impermanent state. Nothing in the world is permanent. This brings to mind the scripture verses of heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. The material world is impermanent and transitory. The only thing that is true, universally true, is the metaphysic, the thing behind reality. So the East, when it comes to knowledge, is interested in the universal. The West is interested in sort of naturalism, things that are material. And naturalism in and of itself is a type of predecessor to empiricism, the idea that our only knowledge we can have is through the senses. While to the East and to true tradition, to be honest, this naturalist idea is kind of an aberration, a strange way of looking at things. You're looking for knowledge in a place where knowledge inherently cannot be present. Through this lens, you can understand what the East and what Guénon is trying to say when research and empirical data is kind of pointless and fruitless from the Eastern point of view. I'm just recording in all the rooms today. We have George in the background there for reasons. He's wearing the Commander Chaddock's glasses, for what it's worth. In Chapter 4, René Guénon really goes in after the historical method. He really goes against the idea that all we can understand from history is through documents, through artifacts, things like that, through material things. And he's specifically talking about one potential challenge to the idea that the Greeks borrowed information from the Indians in the pre-Socratic era is that a historian can say that Greece and India never talked to each other before then. You know, it's the common mainstream historical narrative that contact between India and Greece didn't really start until Alexander's invasion of India. That began cross-cultural interaction. Guénon disagrees with this. He doesn't like the idea that Greece having ideas similar to India are just chalked up as being a coincidence by historians that are following the classical prejudice. Guénon's theory is that indeed, travel in ancient times was not as frequent as it is today, and it wasn't as easy as it was today. In fact, it would have been much slower than it is today. However, Guénon disagrees with the idea that ancient people did not travel. He says that ancient people did travel, and when they traveled, this would be a very meticulous, almost slow travel. It would be meant to learn more about the world around them and other cultures. When they traveled more meaningfully. They weren't traveling for a vacation, they weren't traveling for sightseeing or tourism. Traveling often happened purely just to acquire knowledge about the world, especially Westerners and Greeks with their research mindset. You know, the travelogue was a very popular genre of writing back during ancient Greece, with history itself coming from this travelogue genre. Herodotus's history started off as a travelogue, as him sort of recounting all the different places he's been to and the people he's talked to, and creating a narrative of his world history out of that. The travels of Greek philosophers to far-off lands that historians like to consider as completely legendary to Guénon are not legendary, and there would be no point for them to be legendary. They were purposefully, meticulously done expeditions to learn about the world. Before Greek philosophy, communication between the East and West did in fact happen, even without any migration of peoples. So we have no archaeological data for this, we have no written records for this, we have no genetic data for this, because there's no real intermixing between the peoples from this time period that we can tell. But Guénon says no, they were strongly in contact with each other, they were talking to each other, and there are points in history where it's clear where cultures were in contact with each other, even if we have no solid material data to talk about that communication. Yes, maybe some migrations, tiny, like individual migrations took place, but this would have been rare. This wouldn't have been really noticeable in the genetic record. But we can't say that the whole Near East was some sort of video game-esque invisible wall that separated Greece from India, until Alexander broke that wall by invading into Persia. Guénon gives some historical examples to support this idea. In antiquity, the entire Mediterranean basin, people living across the Mediterranean Sea, used a similar coinage system where you would have a coin, and all across the Mediterranean, these different cultures produced different types of coins that were different in externals and in a secondary nature, but they were still coins used for commerce and trade. Guénon points out that, okay, some historians will say that they're Greek coins that accidentally showed up there, which Guénon points out of, oh look, they're saying everything is an accident or Greek, right? So classical prejudice, right? It only makes sense for the Mediterranean people to have had some sort of contact with each other to agree on this coinage system. We don't have any documents proving that, but that's what must have happened. Some sort of agreement must have been reached. Greece also maintained colonies with her far-flung colonies across the Mediterranean. Is it so far-fetched to believe that the Greeks were able to have contact with other cultures of an equal distance? Guénon points out atomism, which is an idea held in Greek philosophy and in Indian philosophy. So it's a doctrine shared between the two cultures, and he says that the Phoenicians probably brought it over there. Democritus was the first Greek philosopher to adopt atomism that we know of, and he is said to have been a traveler. He traveled to places like Egypt, Persia, and yes, India. It does not make sense for him to have invented atomism by himself. He probably got that idea from India, where much older sources seem to support the idea that atomism started in India. Although we'll talk about older sources and the question of chronology in the next chapter. Guénon posits that the Greeks probably knew about Buddhism as well. Now, there is a marked decline in Eastern influence in Greece as we enter classical antiquity. Once we enter the Socratic era, once Socrates gets that message from the oracle about Socrates being the wisest man, and Socrates goes on a quest to disprove this and ends up proving he's the wisest man, right? Once we get the Socratics, once we get Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, there's sort of a reformation happening within the West, where it starts to diverge from the East. And to be honest, again, Guénon sort of goes hard against the West in this book. I know he softens up in future books. I wouldn't say that the Socrates, Plato, Aristotle philosophical reformation in Greek society was necessarily a bad thing. I think there are times when the West, as it diverges, actually corrects a lot of mistakes from the East. And I think we see that starting to pop up in Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Those are great thinkers. But as time goes on, when the Macedonian Empire invades into India, the Macedonian Empire doesn't really facilitate much cultural interaction from the Indians to the Greeks. And Guénon points to this being mostly because of the Socratic philosophy, Socratic, Platonic, and Aristotelian philosophy, and the dialectical system, syllogism that the Greeks had been using. That sort of calcified the Western mind to make it more difficult for it to really understand Eastern ideas, as opposed to the pre-Socratic age. So we're already getting this very difficult endeavor from Westerners to try to understand the East as early as Hellenistic times. Eastern influence in Greece dies out after Aristotelianism simply because Aristotelianism gives the Greeks a framework within which Eastern ideas cannot grow. There is one exception Guénon gives to this, and that is the Neoplatonists. The Neoplatonists will start to adopt Eastern ideas, including the infinite being a Hindu-Indian idea, infinity. Before then, the Greeks had concepts of like the indefinite and the finished and the perfect, but once the Neoplatonists adopted ideas from India, we start to get the infinite, which the Easterners also equated with perfection, I should say. But it's hard to study this period of history because of the weakness of the historical method. So that brings us to the question of chronology. Guénon kind of goes off on a tangent a little bit on the concept of calendars, specifically to talk about the idea that when a modernist, when a Western person with a Western mindset tries to interact with Eastern documents, or even documents where the West is a little bit more Eastern, like the Middle Ages, like classical antiquity and before, they are sort of at a disadvantage. For example, let's take the question of chronology, let's take the question of calendars, let's take the question of trying to date events from which a document is saying is taking place. Like, for example, the Mahabharata war, the war that is shown in the Vedas, right? Guénon doesn't really like attempts by Westerners to date the Mahabharata war. Mahabharata. I don't remember the name exactly. The word is on the screen. By lacking the traditional worldview, a modernist is unable to really understand documents from that traditional time period. For example, chronology, for example, calendars, for example, years. The number of years a king is said to have reigned isn't really a literal year because, like we talked about in the previous chapters, the East and the traditional worldview isn't really interested in material years. There really isn't a value in that, right? That falls into the whole transitory, impermanent state of the world, right? They're interested in metaphysics. They're interested in deeper realities, not in the way Westerners or modern Westerners think of them today. He concedes that yes, the Chinese calendars, the Chinese records from ancient times do tend to be literal. They do tend to be the exact number. Chinese documents are very accurate for, describing the situation in heaven at that time period, right? We can get solid dates from Chinese sources, even mythical things like the Xia dynasty, Shang dynasty, Zhou dynasty. Archaeological research done completely with the legendary narratives out of mind, if anything trying to disprove the legendary narratives, are actually proving that the ancient Chinese records are really accurate. Our dates for the Shang dynasty we used to think Xia, Shang, Zhou were just completely made up, and then eventually historians had to say, well, okay, it looks like the Zhou were real. And then more recently, Shang is decided to be real, and now we're starting to get into this period where the Xia dynasty, they're starting to accept that the Xia dynasty was real. But China is kind of an outlier when it comes to ancient civilizations and how they count their chronicles, how they write their timelines. The Babylonians use a lot of symbolic years, symbolic time spans. The Indians don't even bother with a date most of the time. And this is going to tick some people off. The Jewish tradition falls into this category of a more symbolic understanding of numbers and of time frames. This is why young Earth creationism is a modernist interpretation of scripture, not necessarily a traditional interpretation. The traditional interpretation would never give that much weight to year numbers, or if they did, not even necessarily understanding those important year numbers to be literal years, material years. But then people try to, date things like the Mahabharata war till after, Greek civilization, when our primary sources from the Greeks tell us that the Egyptians, the Indians, the East was older than the Greeks. Think of the Timaeus, one of Plato's most significant dialogues, where he says that the Egyptians look at the Greeks as if they're children, right? The point is, the historical method only takes into account archaeology, monuments, and documents from a society. Only they can be handled as being true history, and everything else is conjecture. The historical method is insufficient for understanding history. When you find a document like a book, right, even if you date it to a certain time period, the fact that that book existed at that time period, unless you have the first copy of that book to ever have existed, then that means the document is older than that date you've ascribed to that specific artifact. And good luck finding the oldest version of that book. That's very unlikely to find. We can't really exactly date documents. We can determine that they're older than a certain date, but we can't find how old they actually are. Sorry, but the argument that, the prophecies in the Gospels of the fall of Jerusalem that will happen in 70 CE is just a sort of, oh, that must mean because the Jerusalem fell in 70 CE, this gospel that has this prediction of that event must have been made after it, which, how significant would that, why would, that just doesn't work in a number of ways. But we haven't found a gospel that's older than 70 CE that included the prophecy. Well, it's like, that's not how time works. That's not how reality works. You're not going to find, if you are, you're really lucky if you're going to find a gospel before 70 CE that includes the prophecy. But the odds of that is next to none. And saying that a lack of that means that it wasn't a true prophecy just ain't going to work, Holmes. The historical method is useless past a certain point. Think about all the lost media that we have in the 21st century. Commercials, shows that showed up on tape, on a rare tape that nobody has anymore. And now, as far as the historical method is concerned, that media never existed ever, right? Except you've seen the lost media. Just look at the lost media subreddit, right? People are hunting down that lost media. Important documents are often lost through wear and tear, through daily usage, through frequent usage. René Guénon uses an example from the Islamic Golden Age of a text having to be copied by monasteries after in like Baghdad, right? Where a text had to be recopied because it was used so much. And even the more it's used, the more it tears and the more it's hard to recopy it, right? There are very important documents that have been lost over time simply because they've been used a lot. It almost seems miraculous that we have the old ancient texts that we do, which is part of the reason why the Christian tradition holds that a lot of the texts we have from ancient times were indeed miraculously preserved, because against all odds they are still here. This is why the Middle Ages, the people in the medieval period, took very seriously basically every book they read, even if that book was the Iliad. Right? Modern Christians would have a hard time understanding why medieval Christians thought that, yes, Athena exists, right? But that's because the stories of Athena have been preserved in texts that go back to 800 BCE. They have remained for a reason in their worldview, right? Then we have the issue of oral history and traditions that are passed down orally but are never really written down, because those stories can be easily lost if everyone who knows those stories dies out and they never write it down, right? Keep in mind that this was the historical norm for information sharing for a long time, much longer than writing has been around. But even more complicated, the moment you take that oral story and write it down in the written word, you've kind of guaranteed the story is going to disappear, because once it's written down, there's no reason to remember it. There's no reason to remember the intricacies of it, and it's been written down in a language. Well, language and our understanding of words changes over time. Someone reading an ancient story 1,000 years ago is not going to understand it the same way as someone 500 years ago reading the same story, looking at the same words that have changed their meaning, right? And the people who are able to really expound on the story, explain the deep symbolism and lore behind it, they're dying out because that oral history tradition is gone, and now we have the written text. Now, a few generations later, you have the story surrounded by a civilization that doesn't really understand it, because they've lost the people who did understand it, who could interpret it for them and give them what the story is supposed to mean. These esoteric secret meanings of these stories that people just lose if they don't have a auctor, if they don't have a master to interpret the stories. And it's especially true in the West, when the mindset drifts from the traditional mindset to a completely new mindset that starts to look at years on a calendar, years of a chronicle, and think that those are actual years when they were never meant to be seen in that way. They were never meant to be read in that way. A little bit more about language in the next chapter. So that brings us to the topic of language. So for chapter 6 in this book, René Guénon is getting into the topic of language, specifically the concept of what we would call a sacred language. He points out that one difficulty a lot of Westerners have when they are studying Eastern religions, Eastern culture, Eastern anything, right, is that the West has been sort of detached completely from its, maybe not completely, but strongly detached from even the concept of a sacred language. In the East, and traditionally for any sort of metaphysical doctrine or doctrine of that sort, if it's written down, then it will be written down in a sacred language. It is very clearly understood in the traditional mind, in the Eastern mind, that the vernacular, the language of everyday things, should be different from the language of talking about sacred things, talking about eternal truths. Just psychologically, there's an important divide that needs to be made. And that language, that sacred language, is usually frozen in time. And this is how it connects to like the previous chapter about chronology, because modern historians will look at texts written in a certain sacred language and say that it comes from this year or that year, when it's really hard to tell because sacred languages don't really change. Compare that to the modern vernacular languages, which do change over time. He points out that some of the changes that happen in modern religions. He points out that sort of leaving behind the sacred language is a recipe for divergence in a way. Keep in mind, when was the West most like the East? When was the West more traditional? That was the Middle Ages. And what did the Middle Ages have? It had Latin. It had lingua latina. It was a sacred language. But Guénon says that a tradition starts to fall apart when that language starts to be abandoned, or a language can be abandoned not long after after what he calls a dissident doctrine is introduced. So Guénon introduces the idea of a dissident doctrine, this idea of a piece of belief that's counterintuitive to the actual original tradition. It's usually created by some guy or some cult breaking away from the established tradition, doing his own thing outside of the normal bounds of authority. And outside of the normal bounds the tradition usually takes place. This is a dissident doctrine. This is a doctrine that is coming away from the original tradition. And I would describe, the term I would use to describe something not being a dissident doctrine, something fitting into the tradition, I think the term Catholicity is probably the best term I would use to describe that. In sort of the St. Vincent formula of something that is believed by all people everywhere and all times. That is something that is consistent with a tradition. When we start to move away from that Catholicity, we are moving towards dissident doctrine, and we're moving away from the traditional authority of the tradition. And as Guénon points out, dissident doctrines often lead to the sacred language being changed or abandoned, and then that's a recipe for divergence. That's how we lose that stability. And by lacking in the authority that's traditionally held in that tradition, we get what Guénon will call an anti-tradition. A sort of thing that fills in the gap of what usually is filled in by the tradition, but it's not the tradition. It's diverged from the tradition. It's an anti-tradition. He would look at things like Protestantism, for example, to be a type of anti-tradition. Orthodox Christians might look at the idea of papal universal jurisdiction as a type of dissident doctrine, for example. And Guénon points out when a lot of sacred scripture, a lot of ideas are translated from their sacred language into a vernacular, then that brings in a lot of difficulties with interpretation and understanding, because someone who only knows the vernacular, which is by its nature shifting and changing to adapt to certain needs of that time period, is going to read things into texts that weren't originally meant by the author. This is how we get things like young earth creationism again. And one thing I forgot to mention about the anti-tradition. Anti-traditions created by dissident doctrines are what Guénon sees as steps towards something he calls the counter-tradition. No, that's a proper noun, the counter-tradition. It's this idea that as society degenerates, as the world degenerates, and we can talk about the idea of progressive degeneration of the world at another point in time, Guénon believes that eventually there's going to come something that he calls the counter-tradition. There will become one sort of, I guess we would call it a religion, or really it's a whole way of thinking, a whole mindset that is a complete inversion of the actual tradition, the true tradition. Perennialists would look at ideas like the religion of the Antichrist or Satanism as a sort of expression of the counter-tradition. And I would believe that the counter-tradition that Guénon is talking about is what is foretold as the religion of Antichrist, which is at its heart a type of Satanism. But back to the traditional way of thinking, difficulties understanding traditional text. He talks about how an Easterner, and I think for our purposes we can replace it with a traditional person, is going to have difficulty even if they follow a dissident doctrine. Even if they are broken away from their original tradition, they have to fill it in with something, whether it be a dissident doctrine, an anti-tradition, or even the counter-tradition. But they're going to have a hard time engaging with Westerners, which is to say modernist in this case. I'm going to do a little apologetic for the West later on in this video. I think it needs to be done. But Guénon brings up that an Easterner cannot understand a Westerner who seems to operate completely detached from a tradition, because it just is outside of the traditional mindset to be unattached to a tradition. There's this concept Guénon brings up called traditional attachment, which is the quality of an individual or of a society, of what have you, being grounded, being based, participating within an established tradition. And traditional attachment is sort of the norm for society, traditionally speaking. Take a drink every time I say traditional in this part. I want to take a chance here at the end of the video to sort of give a bit of an appendix, a bit of an apologetic for the West in light of the things René Guénon has characterized it as, maybe do some clarifications, clearing up some things, and also just generally my thoughts on the first part of Introduction to the Study of the Hindu Doctrines. Because while I think Guénon has a lot of great ideas, I also think that he is very much a product of his time in many ways, or at the very least that he is definitely reacting to a lot that he's seeing in his time. We have to remember that René Guénon is writing this in the 1920s, this is published in 1921. What sort of world was he writing in France, right? World War I had just concluded. The West is going through a huge sort of identity crisis at this point in time. For a generation they thought that they were the greatest, right? And that they had conquered the world, and that they were civilization compared to the unindustrialized tribes of Africa and Asia. But then World War I shows an unbelievable amount of brutality, an unbelievable amount of death that cripples a lot of the populations of these countries, and really pushes Europe over the edge, especially after all the different trends we've seen in that time period. This is the time period of industrialization really taking over, and those machines the Europeans had valued, that they saw made them above the rest of the world, were now machines used to gun down men by the thousands in no man's land. Industrialization was slowly taking away from the land, taking away nature, right? This is the same time period J.R.R. Tolkien is writing in his wistful, almost nostalgic books, where he's very much warning against industrialization. We're starting to see modernism and even early postmodernism really popping up as intellectual movements in things like the arts, where the Europeans are questioning if meaning actually exists, right? We're seeing a decline in religion. We're seeing nihilism start to grow. The ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche are starting to grow. This is also the time period where the Russian Empire had been overthrown by a bloody revolution and became the Soviet Union. Communism, there's this worldwide fear of this communist revolution coming to destroy everything that people used to love about society. The West was not doing well in the 1920s, and this is the world where Guénon is writing, in a time when the West is losing confidence in itself. But with that in mind, there are some critiques that we can give of Guénon, some things that I don't think he really looked into, some things he kind of groups together that shouldn't be grouped together. Specifically, let's take the question of the West, right? What is the West? I do agree with Guénon's definition of the West being a civilization, a wide, big civilization that includes multiple different societies, cultures, countries. I agree with the idea of Americans and Russians being part of this West. I know that there are some anthropologists, sociologists that try to separate Eastern Europe and separate parts of the Americas from Western Europe and say that they're three completely different civilizations. civilizations. I don't think that's the case. I think they are, and I think they all come from the same three strands that Guénon identifies. I think the West is built on Athens, it is built on Rome, and it's built on Jerusalem. But I would also consider the sort of height of the West would be the Middle Ages, which is how Guénon sort of looks at the West, as the Middle Age as a sort of golden age, right? And I agree with that assessment, but where we disagree is about what happens to the West from there. I believe the West is basically synonymous with what we could call Christendom, or what was once Christendom. So I also agree with Guénon's assessment that the West isn't necessarily a ethnic European thing. It's not necessarily a genetic, blood-related thing. Levantines are considered part of the West, and under the flag of Christendom, we would include people like the Ethiopians and the Armenians and a lot of different groups. Frankly, I would think Christendom would also include like St. Thomas Indian Christians from that time period. What defines the West, what brings the West together is Christianity. It is Christendom. And I think that's the key truth to the West. Now, the Western part of the West does sort of go off on this great divergence. It does break away from the way of thinking held in the Middle Ages, through things like universal jurisdiction of the papacy, through things like the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the World Wars. They sort of go off on their own thing, which is where we see modernity pop in. Modernity is very much a West European American thing. But there is a part of the West that didn't really go down that direction, that did not experience the Renaissance in the same way the West part of the West did, that did not experience the Protestant Reformation, did not really experience the Enlightenment to the same scale, that being Eastern Europe, right? The Slavic countries, Russia, we could even say Greece to some extent, although Greece gets a lot of Enlightenment ideas thrown into it later on. And this is the bastion, this is the heartland of Orthodox Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which very much keeps a lot of the medieval worldview, the traditional worldview, the worldview of Christendom in its metaphorical DNA. Now, it's much weaker than it was at Christendom when there was one united church. It's much weaker after that, but it still keeps that kernel. Guénon never really looks into orthodoxy, as I've mentioned before, and I think that's a big weakness to how he conceives of the West. This idea that the West it is too far gone, right? That it's gone crazy, it's gone insane, and that there's no redeeming qualities of the West. I would say that the West at its core is Christendom, and yes, the Great Divergence is a divergence, it is an aberration, but I don't think when we think of the West, when people like the West, that's not usually what they're talking about. Well, I guess it's complicated. Like, there's multiple Wests. There's the modern West, which definitely has gone down that route. But there's also the West that, traditionalists look back to and really value over other civilizations even. In a way, the West is very divided. The West is sort of the battleground, the big battleground for spiritual forces as the civilization that is kind of symbolic of Christ's incarnation, right? It's Christianity that held the West together. And so because the religion created by God is there in this one area, and because of that, it is a frontline battlefield, right? Very great things have come from the West, very wicked things have come from the West. Guénon points to the divergence of the West from the East to suggest that there was a true primordial tradition that was based on true metaphysics, and that the West moved away from it while the rest of humanity stayed with it. How many times have I done this in this video so far? Now, as a Christian, I would connect, and Guénon doesn't really talk about what he means about metaphysics in this part of the book, but when you read the book and see what he talks about when he talks about metaphysics, he's talking about something that is unknowable, that is beyond all physics, that is something you cannot speak of. The only accurate sentence you can say about the metaphysic is something in the negative form. It is not this, it is not blah blah blah. And how it is through metaphysics that all things have their being, stuff like that. As an Orthodox Christian, when I read Guénon's explanation in his theories around the concept of true metaphysic, it just sounds like God as understood through the Eastern Orthodox tradition. It is literally St. Dionysius the Areopagite's apophatic theology. St. Dionysius the Areopagite really insists on God being something we cannot know, we cannot understand, and we cannot accurately really speak of him, because by putting it into words, it's becoming not what God is, who is ineffable, right? Guénon and St. Dionysius the Areopagite describe metaphysics and God in basically the same way. Now, Guénon's going to connect all religions to that idea of the true metaphysic. I disagree with that. I can see how he comes to that conclusion if he is not considering Orthodox Christianity. However, you know, my sort of idea, and I think the Christian idea is a little bit more complicated. You have this sort of primordial Yahwehism, but you also have things like later on several different falls of humanity, the Tower of Babel incident that led to this spiritual splitting of the nations and the birth of new religions. But you also have things like the Logos Spermaticos. These are all topics I want to talk about on another episode. But all this to say, I get Guénon's context, I get what he's saying it and why he's saying it, but I think he makes his version of the West is more emblematic of an over-reliance of rationalism that we see getting underway in the Renaissance that was experienced in Western Europe, but not the West as a whole. While I agree with how Guénon defines the West as being from Rome, Athens, and Jerusalem, I disagree with the way he uses the term the West in the book. I think what he is talking about when he's talking about the West is really that Renaissance modernity, right? I think whenever he says the West, I think you could just take out the word West and put in the word modernity, right? This after effect of the Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, that stuff. What Guénon calls the East, something more stable, something with a different value hierarchy than what he calls the West, or what we would call modernity, I would call the classical worldview. Really, you have a classical worldview that basically encompasses the entire world up until we see the great divergence from when the West breaks away, and really Western Europe breaks away, right? So one of my big disagreements with this book is how Guénon categorizes East and West. What he calls the East, I would just simply call the classical worldview with which the West at its height participated in. And what he calls the West, I would call modernity. And this is interesting when we connect it to some ideas that exist in the Christian tradition. I believe in the Alexandrian World Chronicle, which was written as a work of universal history by Christians. It sort of talks about this idea of the fourth son of Noah, Yonton, who is kind of like the ancestor to the East, to India, to China, that area. And then it talks about Japheth, who is like the ancestor to the Europeans. There's this idea in the Christian tradition that from Yonton and the East, that's where spirituality in a way is. That's where a connection to this sort of abstract metaphysical truth exists. What Guénon is identifying is not something new. It's something that exists in like ancient sources from the early 600s of the East, of India, of China, being this source of spiritual understanding, of not being tied down by materialistic things. While the sons of Japheth are going to be really good with their hands. They're going to be really good at making things. They're really going to be good at putting together technology. This is an idea that's existed for over 1,000 years. But in the Christian tradition, when we contextualize this idea, there's sort of a warning from the early Christians saying that the Yonton spirituality of ignoring the world and just focusing on the spirit and focusing on the metaphysic and sort of rejecting the idea that the created world actually matters, that's a dangerous idea. That's an idea that we see sometimes in like Neoplatonism and Gnosticism, things like that, which Christianity rejects. Christianity is very much a religion that believes in the importance of both the material and the immaterial. That's one of the places where Christianity is kind of special, in that the immaterial is absolutely important. We are humans with souls. There is an immaterial God, right? It's all this stuff. Heaven came into earth. The Son of God came down into earth, right? But it also means that the material world matters too. Not only are you a soul, you are a body. A human being is an embodied soul. You're required to have a material body to be a human being, to be a creation, right? What we do in this world matters. We are here to participate in the creation on Earth, right? You can't just ignore, you know, the whole material aspect. This material aspect was created by God and he saw that it was good. I think Guénon is kind of falling into this this trap of saying, oh, the East has this strong immaterial metaphysical understanding. They have a better understanding of the truth, while the West is diverging into super-rationalism. No, I think the core, the key, you know, I think Aristotle says that a true virtue is the middle between two extremes. The true middle, the truth really, is the union of the unseen and the seen as made by God, as I said at the beginning of this video when I stole it from the Lord of Spirits introduction. Which is why I believe that the Middle Ages, as what Guénon would say is like the midpoint between what he describes as the West, modernity, and what he describes as the East, the classical worldview. The medieval worldview, the ideas of Christendom, I think are the ideal. And Christendom ultimately is the West, right, when it gets down to it. Yes, the West, it depends on what you mean by the West, but the West is diverging from that. But the ideal ultimately is that medieval synthesis, that medieval worldview. But we should also understand that we're never going to reach perfection here on Earth, not before the eschaton, right? The only way things can be perfect is when humanity has lost its fallen nature, and that's not going to happen until the eschaton. This video is also kind of complicated because we're talking a lot about some Guénonian concepts that he hasn't really explained yet as far as where we are in the book is concerned. In part 2 of the book, Guénon is going to go into things like the principles of Eastern, traditional, classical thought. He's going to really explain what a tradition is, what he means by civilization, what he means by metaphysics. He's going to talk about the relationship metaphysics has with things like religion, theology, and philosophy. And he's also going to talk about symbolism, which is really, really important to understand, as well as how doctrines are propagated in a society. But there you have it. That is my strange video that I don't really know how to title, where we go through the first part 1, preliminary questions of René Guénon's An Introduction to the Study of the Hindu Doctrines. This was like the longest recorded video I've ever done. I have hours of footage that I need to start editing. But if you made it this far in the video, you probably really like history, you probably really like lore and tradition. So maybe you'll like this channel, this YouTube channel. Consider looking around, look at my videos, check out this channel, and if it's something you think you like, then consider subscribing. It would really help out the channel. And you know, follow me on all the social media, links are in the description. But I know this was a long video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hopefully I'll make an episode on part 2 of the book at some point, maybe 5 years from now. But without any further ado, thank you all so much for watching and have a great day, ladies and gentlemen. See ya.